All right, there you go. Perfect. So if you're not familiar with Open North, so we're a nonprofit organization. We work across various sectors in Canada, Turtle Island, and globally to foster effective, responsible, and collaborative use of data and technology, right, as well as to solve complex problems. All right. So Open North is based on the land of the St. Lawrence, Iroquois, Mohawk, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee, I'm sorry, really, I have a hard time with this name, Haudenosaunee people, I'm sorry about that, on what is now known as the island of Montreal. All right. We acknowledge that Indigenous people who prior to and after the arrival of the French encountered one another on this territory that we know as the island of Montreal. All right. So what's an open smart community is a really important topic, right? So as smart cities became more and more popular, realized that city stakeholders and decision makers were faced with options that were a bit top-down, privatized, normally putting solutions before problems, right? So we did some research with Dr. Tracey Lauriault, who is here in this call with us today, came up with the first definition for open smart city, right? That is one where all stakeholders collaborate to mobilize data and technologies in ways that are ethical, accountable, and transparent. Governing the city is a fair, viable, and livable commons, thus balance economic development, social progress, and environmental responsibility. So overall, it's a very holistic approach. All right. So about the Community Solutions Network. It's a program of Futures Canada led by our partner Evergreen, and us Open North. We offer we're the lead technical support, right? And it's funded by Infrastructure Canada. The goal of this program is really to help communities of all sizes across Canada explore smart city approaches, and we do that by sharing information, building knowledge and capacity, as well as creating networks. All right. We lead the advisory service within this program, and we provide access to experts and over 20 courses in both English and French. Actually, for a limited time, you're able to have access to these courses. All right. Dom, we share in the chat, she hasn't done that already, some links to join our LMS as well as to check the research briefs. All right. So just to give you a little bit of context on this webinar series, as part of the Community Solution Network, we have worked with experts to write about emerging smart city issues, and we have published a number of research briefs, right, which you can access through the Community Solutions portal. We have shared that link as well in the chat box. And with this series, we really like to host conversations based on the topics that we have explored in these research briefs. All right, so without further ado, I'll give the floor to our moderator, Andrew. So Andrew, please take it away.
Thanks, Lucas, and it's great to be here. So just to give you a quick bite on who I am, I run public policy at Transit right here in Montreal, which is the largest public transportation app in North America, but I also work as an Open Smart City advisor with Open North. And I'm extremely excited to be here today for the two reports that we're going to talk about. I think they are both excellent pieces of work in their own right, but you kind of get a 2-for-1 special by showing up today. So if we haven't already, I think we'll share the links to download the reports or look at them directly in the chat, which is great. There they are. And so I want to just talk a little bit about what's in those reports at a very high level before I turn it over to our speakers to walk you through what they've written about. So like I said, we have two reports. And the first one is Technology Procurement, Shaping Future Value. And we have one of the authors of that report, Matthew Claudel, who's here with us today. And the second one is Shared Mobility in Canada, Considerations for Open Smart Cities. And we have both authors of that report here today. And so I think individually, they're both exciting pieces of work. If you look at Technology Procurement, that report outlines how important and powerful a tool cities have when they're procuring new technology to shape the future and steer it in the public interest. And the second report describes something that I've been working on for quite a long time and find very interesting, which is the emergence of shared mobility. Everything from Uber to communauto to bike and scooter sharing is creating new pressure and tension in the urban mobility system, and how public agencies can respond on a technology front. So they're both interesting in their own right, but I also think it's interesting to see how there's some overlapping topics within those two reports. Particularly, as we've seen over the last several months during the pandemic, many public agencies are turning to procuring things like on-demand transportation offered by private shared mobility operators. And how can procurements like that help shape the future of technology in the shared mobility space? That's just one of the overlapping parts of those two reports that we can mine a little bit in the questions. So the most important part of this session is going to be the presentations that are coming up next, but we also really want to leave a lot of time and focus on the Q&A from you. So if you have questions right now, you can feel free to use the chat box to put them in there. I'll be watching out for them and teeing those up for our speakers as we get to the latter part of this hour. So please feel free to throw them in there as you have them, or get them ready when we get to that point of the conversation. So I'm extremely excited to present our first speaker, which will be, which order are we going in? Who's going to go first? Okay, perfect. Tracey Lauriault. So Tracey, I'll let you introduce yourself and your co-author, and you can take it away on the main themes of your report.
All right, maybe we can skip straight up. We can see myself here, then you'll see Donato in the next slide, and then we can start right to the text. How about we do that? Hi, everyone. This is a great, lovely afternoon. I want to give a little shout out to Nabil Ahmed, who's here, who helped us out quite a bit in the production of these particular policy briefs. So I'm Tracey Lauriault, Associate Professor of Critical Media and Big Data at Carleton University. And we have here also today Donato Leon, who's a soon-to-be graduate student in the School of Communication and Journalism at Carleton University, who worked with us on this shared mobility transdisciplinary project that was originally funded by Transport Canada and led out of the Carleton University Immersive Studios in the Israeli School of Architecture. And when we started to look at this more broadly, our inventory had identified at least 45 different services operating across the country, mostly in big urban centers, and shared mobility was serving thousands and thousands of people in myriad ways. How do we define this thing called shared mobility? We cobbled up this following definition for you. We consider it to be a complex ecosystem where vehicles are shared by one or more users via services and networks, or mobility as a service, if you will. They've proliferated as a result of smart devices, Internet of Things, smartphones, apps and platforms, peer-to-peer technologies, digital payment systems, location-based services, algorithmic routing software, amongst many other advances in networking, storage, and computing. Shared mobility services, you can access them publicly. They can be public, they can be private, they can be cooperative. They're owned in those different types of ways, and they have different types of business arrangements. They often have fleets of free-floating or station-based types of vehicles that are owned or co-owned, or maybe accessed as part of a membership system, or individually owned and shared with others, or maybe a ride can be hailed, for instance, and you share your car as an underutilized form of capital. Individuals can hail rides. A city can partner with a shared mobility organization to extend transit, or a company, instead of owning a fleet of cars, can be a member of an on-demand car sharing service. There are many different kinds of shared mobility services, and these are the categories that we've identified. And they're rather large grouping, and they're not perfectly mutually exclusive, but it's useful to think of them in this way. There's taxi-like ride sourcing, so Uber would be that kind of shared mobility. There's on-demand car sharing, think of communauto. There's micro-mobility bike share systems like Bixi, for example, or scooter share systems like Lime. There might be micro-transit via high occupancy or perhaps high-demand vehicles like minibuses or shuttles for interregional collaboration and sharing, like Transdev, for instance, out west. Or there could be some hybrid variations of these particular models like Uber Pool. Now I'm going to pass it over to Donato, who's going to explain why shared mobility is important, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the risks and the opportunities of shared mobility. Over to you, Donato.
Thanks, Tracy, for that introduction on our brief. And just before I get going, I just want to thank all of the viewers here today for coming to watch, and for Open North for holding this webinar. And I'm just really excited to be here and to share some of the work that me and Tracy have done. So for shared mobility and thinking about why they're important, I think this is usually considered in terms of policy and governance in cities. So shared mobility has seen explosive growth in adoption rates in cities, especially, of course, as these services offer great user experience, easy to use applications, and on the now almost ubiquitous smartphone, and very flexible and on-demand services at your fingertips. And this wide adoption really means that shared mobility has become an important element of municipal transportation networks, and therefore highly relevant in the planning, policies, and governance of transportation in cities. The prominence of shared mobility technologies, though, represents both opportunities and risks for municipal transportation services. You can see some of them on the screen there now. In terms of opportunities, shared mobility offers ways to augment current public transportation options and potentially increase transit adoption. So for instance, some modes of shared mobility like micromobility or car sharing can be strategically integrated as first and last mile travel options to connect people to transit hubs and to encourage transit usage. Shared mobility also has the potential to connect rural areas that are often underserved with urban centers and cities, which also shows some promise for sustainability, especially as rural areas tend to have very high rates of single car ownership. Bridging from this idea of sustainability as well, shared mobility can also be beneficial for reaching policy goals related to the environment and health. So encouraging public transit usage with attractive mobility solutions could reduce the amount of individual and personal cars that are on the road, potentially reducing GHG emissions and rush hour congestion as a result. Increasing adoption of modes like micromobility for short-term trips can also assist in reducing the ecological impact of transportation, while also enabling healthy, active forms of transportation for citizens in cities. Some modes like microtransit have even proven effective as accessible on-demand options for disabled peoples, elderly, and for healthcare trips. And there's also a potential here for change in urban shape and form. So reducing single car ownership means that there's less of a need for more pavement, more parking spaces to house individual cars. And we can start to focus more on building accessible and sustainable urban forms like park and rides and bike share lanes. On the other hand, in terms of risks, shared mobility can be massively disruptive, as we've seen in a lot of cities. When not integrated into public transportation governance effectively, services can actually compete with public transit options and impact ridership. Some modes, particularly ride sourcing like Uber, have even been shown to increase the number of cars on the road and contribute to traffic congestion and packed curbs and poor GHG emissions when drivers are doing what they call deadheading or driving around without passengers. There's also some considerations that need to be made about accessibility in some modes of shared mobility. So peer drivers, for instance, may not be trained or have the equipment to assist people with disability. As well, shared mobility is very dependent on ICT and smart devices, meaning low income or underbanked and unbanked people may lack the smartphones, credit cards, or data plans that are really needed to access these options, which can be a really big barrier for many. And finally, again, building from this notion of how ICT-driven shared mobility is, services collect vast amounts of sensitive data and identifiable data about traffic flows, individual movements and trips, and financial transaction data. So a lot of private information about the users of these applications are housed there. And so there are big risks in terms of privacy and security, which have been compromised before with some services. I think one of the biggest examples was back in around 2015, then Uber had a big breach and they lost a lot of driver information that was stolen. So The limited amount of public control over these data illustrates the importance, I think, of not only governing mobility, but also the technologies and data that are driving these developments. And it's important to find a balance in government that encourages innovations, but also protects the privacy and confidentiality interests of citizens. And I think on that note that we can move into some of the key takeaways about shared mobility governance and management in cities. And so I'll pass it back over to Tracey.
Thanks, Donato. So when you think about it, shared mobility from a user perspective seems so easy and so seamless. You go to the app on your phone, you call a stranger. Remember, we were told never to call strangers and get into the cars with strangers. Well, here we go. You watch them come your way on a map. You get picked up by a driver with their own car, and then you digitally pay them. Or you book a car for the weekend from the car share co-op, or perhaps on the way home from the pub, responsibly, of course, you and your friends QR code yourself an e-scooter and then park them away very nicely when you get home. But when you also think about, that simplicity hides a tremendous amount of complexity that's going on in the background to make all of this happen. So first and foremost, this is a really complex ecosystem of data, technology, networks, policy, laws, regulation, transaction, storage, global positioning systems, and of course, people and myriad decisions have to be made. For example, data and technology governance and collaboration with service providers are absolutely key. And I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that when we start thinking about procurement. So issues such as privacy, data sovereignty, and issues of cybersecurity are key. There needs to be some governance across sectorally as part of transportation management, but also as urban planning, also thinking about labor and also thinking about information technology systems. This ecosystem also requires multi-jurisdictional collaboration between provinces and territories and the federal government because they manage different road systems, different regulatory environments, different types of laws, especially when you have some interregional types of collaborations between shared transportation. And of course, there's a whole world of permits, parking and speeding fines, zoning bylaws, tax reductions and possibly incentives for providers, regulation, licensing, bylaw, labor laws or curb space management, etc. And then of course, we have much to learn and to gain from the real-time data that are generated from shared transportation systems. And if they're offered by the private sector or of course by a cooperative, etc., there needs to be some kind of agreement to share those data through licensing, and that ought to be discussed through procurement. And that data sharing can provide us a tremendous amount of information on how to plan better. And then what about integration with transit technologies, such as your Opus cards or your Presto cards? And of course, the entire infrastructure that is actually not so great at the moment in Canada of charging stations for electric cars. And of course, how do we make equity and inclusion to address labor relations in driver for hire services and to ensure that there are gig worker protections? And that perhaps is a consideration for procurement as well. And essentially, we need some kind of systems thinking and interoperability in terms of technology, law, standards, and policy. So, and when we were looking at this and when we were doing this kind of research, we were imagining some kind of common approach across the country with a bit of local flair, but a lot of integration and systems thinking to be able to bring these things together in a fair, accountable, and a transparent way. And finally, we're also going to really have to alter how we transport people. I'm in Europe at the moment, and I'm in a country, I'm in Sweden, where shared transportation is the norm, and cities are not ruled by the car. Cities are ruled by shared transportation and pedestrians. So we really need to rethink how we do this. And we're also going to have to think about financial incentives to support cities to transition, as well as to be able to support some small Canadian companies to have some, and to support them so that they can grow and provide alternative forms of services. Donato is going to close off our session before we pass it on to Matthew to provide a little bit of a segue into how all of this relates to procurement. Over to you, Donato.
Thanks, Tracey. So We didn't do a super deep dive into procurement, but we did look at procurement in our brief as a mechanism to enable governance of shared mobility in smart cities. So effective procurement strategies in the shared mobility space is critical, as most of the technical capacity and expertise for these digitally enabled services is focused heavily in the private sector. In the context of an open smart city, developing procurement guidelines and toolkits could be beneficial to ensure that cities can set the terms of contracting arrangements in a way that benefits all, especially the public good. And so some procurement opportunities in the mobility space that we looked at include avoiding market domination and takeover of public space by large multinational companies by procuring local and small enterprises. One example we looked at was car sharing cooperatives, which place ownership and control of vehicle fleets in the hands of local users of the service. Procurement can also be designed to encourage open smart city principles in private mobility operations, such as requiring sustainability practices, accessibility, and training for for-hire drivers. And this process has to be transparent so as to ensure the accountability and sovereignty interests of citizens are protected. Procurement also offers an opportunity to set the terms of gaining public value from these services, both in the present and over time. Things like requirements for data sharing or open data, GHG reduction plans, and privacy measures. And these are all things that can be tracked and accounted for by cities in these arrangements. An example for anybody interested in kind of an open smart city form of procurement standard is the open contracting data standard produced by Open Contracting Partnership, which establishes a common model for transparency and data disclosure in contracting agreements. And so I'll leave it at that as a nice little segue to our next brief with our procurement expert, Matthew, here on the panel.
Hi, my name is Matthew. Andrew, I don't know if you'd like to jump in here at all.
You're doing great. Introduce yourself and take it away.
Sure. My name is Matthew Claudel. I am not a procurement expert, but thank you. That's a really generous introduction. My PhD is in advanced urbanism from MIT, and I'm the founder of a strategic design firm called Field States. I'm also affiliate faculty at Portland State University, and really excited to be here with you now. I want to acknowledge my co-author on this paper, Bianca Wiley, who is a terrific mind and a brilliant collaborator. She knows a lot about procurement, and together we kind of explored a really complex topic, and I'm excited to share some basic ideas with you. I'll try and be really succinct. Actually, Don brought up a lot of the key points that we try to communicate in this paper. But essentially, procurement, as most of you here will know, is essentially when cities buy things. And so they can issue a call for information about existing available technologies, and they can also share a set of requirements that can be satisfied by an existing technology, or which can inspire a vendor or a provider to develop a new technology. Procurement's governed by various rules that prevent corruption, and they limit municipalities' capacity to spend over a certain amount, especially without an open bidding process. And the most important thing really is that procurement is boring. It's incredibly mundane and routine. And we thought that was an interesting opportunity to think about how it's actually an incredibly powerful tool for shaping public value in the future. And that's what we explored in this paper. Now, public value, what is future public value? We define it as the monetary or non-monetary worth of an asset or service at some point in the future, including the right to govern or control that service. And by governance and control, I mean how it's monetized, whether or not it can exclude certain people, or or how it's used. Current value, on the other hand, is something that can be bought and sold and measured quite straightforwardly. So cities procure a stapler, or they procure a service contract for waste disposal. And there's some present value to those things. The future value is the capacity to use the waste management truck routing data to dispatch them more effectively through software, for example. It's how a city can control the price of the waste disposal system, let's say 20 years down the line, when perhaps we're doing new kinds of recycling that actually generate revenue. And so when a city is going out to procure waste management technology, they can set the terms of that future public value. And procurement's where they can say, hey, we want to have a right to some of this data because in the future we believe it can be monetized or it can be valuable, and it can serve in the public interest. So procurement's this place where the public sector can lose or gain its influence over particular technologies. It's where it can be engaged with the technological design process. And it's where government can shape the market of technologies in a particular domain. So in other words, procurement, and the bottom line is that procurement is where future public value is defined and created and protected. And so I'm really excited to think about procurement in the context of mobility. And I'm actually most interested, I was taking notes as you were speaking, I'm most interested in where these topics diverge, actually. So there are a certain set of things, of technologies, of mobility services that a city might directly procure and pay for, like buses. And there we can say, okay, we want buses that are low emissions. But there is a whole host of technology emerging, and you explored it specifically with the shared mobility, where the government doesn't get to procure. Like cities, well, with a couple exceptions, but cities never procured Uber as a service for getting citizens from point A to point B. And so I do want to explore that a little bit in our Q&A session. But for now, a few key takeaways from the paper that we wrote. And I encourage you to take a look at it because procurement's complex and we got into a lot of interesting stuff. But the key takeaways are that it's crucial to start a procurement process by imagining what the future public value might be. And so this is when public servants can be creative and speculative, right? Like, let your mind go crazy. How might this thing be abused? How might it actually generate value in the public interest? The second is that there's often a trade-off between the present value and the future value. So for example, it might seem like a software platform is going to simplify civic, municipal operations or a particular thing. And it might seem that procuring this will, save us money in the short term. However, that often comes at a price in the long term. And what's tricky about this is that political cycles often disincentivize you from thinking about that future value. The third is that it's crucial for a procurement process to include exit ramps. Very often when a city decides to start procuring something, it's almost a foregone conclusion that that thing will be procured. And we find it very important that a city always maintains the right to say no and encourages a procurement process to say, you know what, maybe this is the wrong thing, or maybe we've poorly defined the actual problem that we're trying to solve with this technology. Fourth, that tech procurement can come from any department. Very often technology gets shoved towards the IT department, or in the instance where a city has a smart city department, they'll be the ones doing the technology procurement. But there's a lot of opportunity for example, the parks department to say, hey, we know that that tree canopy monitoring is a really powerful opportunity for resolving some of the redlining and equity issues around which neighborhoods have trees. That parks department should be the one procuring technology and developing capacity to define the technology and use it. And finally, new procurement approaches can fit within existing policy frameworks. So like I said at the beginning, procurement's boring. You can use it. It's something cities do every day. And it's something that can completely transform the public interest and public value. It's a tool we have, and I believe we need to start using it. So with that, I encourage a lot of questions. I'm excited to talk to you. Many of you are practitioners, and I encourage you to tell us where we're wrong or share your ideas about how these topics can be advanced further.
Great. Thanks, Matthew, and thanks, Tracy and Donato, for the presentations. I think that's extremely helpful and great information that I think was not out there before. So just as a reminder, you can download the reports. The links are available in the chat. And also in the chat, I would love for you to put your Q&A. So as Matthew said, one of the reasons we're here is to hear from you about what has been missed in those reports, or where the authors could add more, or where they're wrong if we want to get even more interesting. So please throw those in there. I have a few questions that I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask to the panelists, but then we're going to try and move quickly to your questions. So if you put them in there now, and if you get in early, that means I'll see it early, and maybe your question gets asked first as an incentive to kind of jump in right now. So Matthew, I want to just pick up on something you said and throw it right back to you. You talked about where the procurement lens you're taking on the tech problem doesn't overlap with shared mobility, which I think is interesting. But just before we get there, why don't we talk a bit about where it does? I think there are, like I mentioned in the opening, there are more places, and you even alluded to the fact that Uber is in some places itself being procured as a transit complement or substitute in some places. So that's only one example. So how do you think the lens you're taking on procurement can actually help get some of what we're looking for in terms of public interest in the shared mobility space?
Yeah. So the municipality can spell out a set of requirements in a direct procurement, and those can shape markets. And this, I think, is particularly true in larger cities, or when cities collaborate and procure with similar requirements. So a really nice example that I've encountered is what the city of Boston did with side guards on trucks. So I'll just be very brief, but most of the bicycle accident deaths happen because trucks don't have side guards. So essentially, if someone gets hit, they'll pass underneath the truck. And a side guard is an extremely cheap, very simple technology that prevents a bicyclist from being trapped underneath the truck, and you'll get hurt, but you're not going to die. It's a good thing. And Boston was able to kind of augment its procurements, change its procurement, so that any vendor that's using a truck and doing something for the city will have to have side guards on that truck. Now, companies that are doing things with trucks in the city of Boston, the city is one of the main kind of purchasers for those companies. And so they're incentivized to start putting side guards on all the trucks, because the side guards are frankly very cheap. And so what Boston's done is move to the market. And I think that's an incredibly powerful tool. And what's tricky about this is that often it'll be a solution in one department that's actually affecting outcomes in another. So for example, it's the municipal waste department that's thinking about trash trucks and kind of managing that provider relationship, whereas it's the transportation department that's thinking about bicycle lanes and bicycle deaths. And so there needs to be a lot of internal coordination in order to achieve those shared outcomes. But I think procurement is one of the important places you can do that. And a couple other points to answer your question. I think a city, a municipality can procure in a kind of challenge-oriented way. And this is with, it's like kind of adjacent to procurement, but the idea of advanced market commitment. And so that's outside of a strict procurement process, but kind of committing to become let's say a customer of a particular service provider if certain conditions are met. And that can be kind of in developing a new technology.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Tracey or Don, you want to weigh in, but I also have another question for you, Tracey. Yeah, do you want to go on that question? Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're the tension that you brought up earlier, Matthew, at the end of your talk about procurement and shared mobility. The town of Innisfil, for instance, a small town, chose Uber instead of providing a transit system and developed a direct partnership with them. So that's an interesting arrangement when you have small town Ontario or small town Canada, anywhere in Canada, and you need to provide some kind of other solution. I might have chosen a different approach, but I certainly would consider a communautaire or something else as a strategy to provide transit or an alternative transportation system for the residents of the town that I'm in, or even interregional carpooling, especially now that we've lost Greyhound. How are we going to be transporting people in between cities and between towns? And can these kinds of agreements, which are in a sense types of procurement activities, if there's a financial exchange, or even a licensing exchange, right? Which might be procurement through a different avenue. You can get a license to operate here if you do this. You can have a license to operate and include accessibility if you train your staff on how to deal with disabled people and moving them around, or seniors. You can receive a license if we know that you have fair labor practices at play. Otherwise, we're going to have to procure only from those, or we put a call out. So bumpers is one thing, but another one could simply be, we expect fair wages, fair labor practices from those, and fair and a decent amount of training for the drivers or different providers before we will even think of procuring any of these services. So setting the stage for a value set, I think, is very, very possible. In addition to agreements with regards to data sharing, which we're starting to see, and or the standardization and the exchange of those data so that we can gain some intelligence from some of the rides that people are taking, of course, without violating people's privacy. So I think there's all kinds of really interesting ways to do this. And what I like with what you said is it's possible to set the stage for what is desired through procurement, and then people have to bid based on what those desires are.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Innisfil. I think that that was an experiment that actually didn't go very well, and it's an example of a place where procurement could have actually shaped the outcomes to be much better. I think the asymmetry of power and control over how the service was actually provided between Uber and the city was important in defining that. And I think we're probably going to get to standard data formats, which would have been an opportunity to, for example, at least have more visibility over the ways that the service was impacting, or Uber was impacting public service delivery in the town.
Exactly.
I also make sure we get
That's
to
the open smart city definition.
Right. And I want to make sure, Andrew, that we flag the idea of licensing. I see that we have Patrick from the city of Montreal, who's done a lot of thinking on transportation and some of the shared mobility in Montreal, which is a city that had an interesting approach to granting licenses to various service providers for the little scooters. So anyway, maybe if we have audience participation, I just want to flag those two things.
Sure. But Tracey, you just mentioned quickly this open smart, what open smart cities and mobility, which, in some ways you presented up top, but just to dig in a little bit on that, we have this open smart cities framework that obviously goes much beyond transportation and shared mobility. So how do you think about what it actually means when we get down into the nitty gritty of shared mobility and transit?
Well, you introduced the definition early, right, where we together mobilize data and technologies when warranted in an ethical, accountable, and transparent way to govern the city as a fair, viable, and livable commons. And when Donato went through the opportunities and the risks, we could see right there some of the tensions between things that are fair, viable, sustainable, etc. Now, when we get more deeply into the open smart city definition, we can start thinking also of technology decision-making, right? So one of the themes that we have, theme 3, for example, states that Data and technologies should be fit for purpose, that they should be repaired and queried. Their source code are open and adhere to open standards. They ought to be interoperable, durable, secure, and locally procured and scalable. So thus procuring locally and or coming up with and dealing with some of the asymmetries that Matthew brought up. And that data and technology are used and acquired to reduce harm and bias, but also increase sustainability and enhance flexibility, thus accessibility, dealing with seniors and so on. And we may have to defer to automated decision makings, which is absolutely the case when it comes to shared transportations and algorithmic routing and pricing at different times of the day, as well as just simply, if we had the opportunity to be able to see all of the real-time data in a map and watching the ebbs and flows of transportation, the multiple modes of transportation in a city, we might be able to gain intelligence from that kind of data and that kind of mapping to actually change the urban shape and form of the city and to provide transportation where warranted and needed in different ways. And then finally, the big one, right, that was one of the issues of Innisfil, and I'm really glad you brought up those pitfalls, Matthew, was that data management ought to be the norm when negotiating and embarking on any type of big procurement of especially complex technologies such as shared mobility systems and multiple shared mobility systems, and especially so if they're going to be integrated with existing systems like Opus and so on and so forth, and existing transit systems. And so data management's the norm. We ought to maintain custody and control over data that are generated by these systems, and these ought to be held and exercised in the public interest. And governance includes sovereignty, data residency, possibly open by default to a certain extent, security and cybersecurity, individual and social privacy, and also granting people, if we start thinking of the EU GDPR, granting people some authority over their personal data. And so if we look at the themes of the Open Smart City definition and the definition itself, they act as a kind of decision-making tree that you can embrace and adopt as you're going through the really complex aspects of building a procurement contract or agreement, for example, in addition to looking at standards and so on, such as the open contracting standards that were brought up by Donato. As well as creating this environment of engagement. We didn't talk a lot about public engagement here today in the slides. Maybe we'll get some questions, but public engagement is also something that's really important, especially since this is shared transportation and it is citizens and residents that will be using it, and they may have really important things to say with what they would like to have.
Great. So I'm gonna ask at least one more question before going to some that we have in the chat. I see Rashi has a question we can answer, and Matthew is answering some in the chat directly, which is great. If you have more questions, please throw them in there. Like we said, we're very eager to get your feedback. So I'm going to do at least one more, and then I'll start pulling directly from the Q&A. And Tracey, Matthew, and Don, this is not in our list we had beforehand, but it's come up so many times that I kind of have to ask a question, which is that you both talked about the fact that in many cases, departments that are not the IT department or the tech department, whatever that may be called, are dealing with technology problems, right? Tracey, you talked about, managing curb space or, all kinds of traditional transportation problems that weren't necessarily technology problems. Matthew, you've talked about that in a procurement context as well. So given that, I think we need public agencies that are able to do that kind of work. And I think it's come up in several of your reports that in some ways procuring technology from an outside vendor may be just as technically complicated as building yourself, if not more so. So how do we actually equip our cities to be able to do this in departments that weren't necessarily wholly focused on technology before? And anybody who wants to jump on that one, free to go first.
Do you want to start off, Matthew?
Go for it, Tracey. Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things that's become very obvious during COVID, and that's become very obvious in many of the debates, let's say around facial recognition technology and so on, as well as gender issues with regards to artificial intelligence and machine learning and so on, is that if you have a homogeneous, demographically uniform team of people with a very specific kind of technical knowledge, making technological decisions in the absence of other experts, social policy experts, for example, accessibility and disabled people, people with lived experience, for example, consulting with the public, Without diverse teams of, let's say, women on their teams, without urban planners on their teams, or even transportation specialists, as well as the bylaw officers, the people who drive around in their cars who are seeing, I made a little gesture towards the dropping off of the e-scooters all over the place, which is making people grumpy everywhere in the world. And that's maybe why we can't have nice things. How do we actually address some of those issues? And my argument always is, these issues are cross-disciplinary and they're multi-sectoral, and they're also intersectional, and we ought to be bringing diverse people into those conversations. We ought not regulate public policy as well as urban planning, as well as all forms of planning that deal with, with people, to the IT department. And the IT department also, and all of these decisions ought to be part of the urban plan and transportation plans and master plans, which is where a lot of public engagement comes into the equation. And at this time, we have not made the transition in most cities. Some cities have, and I think Matthew's got some nice examples. Some cities have done this, but most cities relegate those decisions to the technical departments and haven't done these kind of transdisciplinary multi-sectoral teams in that decision making. And I think that that's one of the cultural transformations that we're beginning to see with regards to how we had to respond with COVID in relation to data issues. And I think, and I hope that we can continue to learn from that so that we can actually begin to plan and roll these things out differently. Same as procurement shouldn't just be left to the auditing and the accounting department. There has to be legal has to be brought in as well, and so on. So I think decisions can't be stovepipe decisions by one unit anymore. We really need diverse teams.
Right,
Yeah.
Matthew, do you want to add anything before I go to the audience?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the exploration of future public value is something that should be across departments and across disciplines. So you early in your presentation, you raised the issue of public health and how active modes will improve public health, whether it's individual, getting exercise or the clean air that results. And so, it's clear that that should be embedded in a procurement for a technology, even if it's not the core capacity of a transportation department. And so I think there needs to be a clear forum within the municipal government for declaring what those possible outcomes, exploring, and then collaboratively deciding on what those possible outcomes might be, and using procurement to kind of shape and direct us in that direction. And the final point I want to make, which again Tracey touched on, is that this takes time and it takes capacity building. So it's one thing to kind of buy a technology and expect to pick it up off the shelf and then plug it in and use it. But in many cases, I think there is this parallel effort of capacity building. And that's to maintain the technology so you don't get stuck in these kind of predatory service contracts. It's the capacity to use the technology for an entirely new purpose. You might buy something for one thing and hey, if it works great, you can use it for something else, and that actually is maximizing the value of the thing. And so I think there's a lot of capacity building that can happen in parallel with procurement. Even writing a good procurement will require technical knowledge. And that just means time, and it means investing in staff. It means investing in a process and saying, we want to take this seriously rather than just buy the quickest thing that looks good and get it up and running. I don't have an easy solution for that, but I think it's an organizational and cultural change.
Great. Tracey, I know you had a quick follow-up, but then I want to get to there's two questions on how COVID-19 has impacted shared mobility. So I want to get there, but I'll just let you close out the thought.
A fun little thing I discovered here. There's no building that can be built in Swedish cities without having access to direct sun at some point in time in the day. And that is directly related to SADS and very long nights in the wintertime and high suicide rates. So that means there's a direct integration and systems thinking about health and regulation, lived experience, and living conditions. And this is something that we're not really great at. Our budgets aren't integrated in Canada. We don't know what's going on with health. And it's difficult to say that Bixies are going to lead to better health because we don't have that connection between things. So anyway, it's just a little anecdotal example of some other ways that we might learn to think about things.
Great. So I think maybe Donato, we can bring you in here if you'd like, because we have a couple of questions on COVID-19. Anybody can answer, but both Nabil and Rashi have talked about the impact specifically on shared mobility, but mobility in general over the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, huge declines in public transport ridership that's been much talked about, also on some of the newer shared modes. So the questions are, do you expect a rebound? And if so, which technologies should municipalities look to most closely as they seek to rebuild public transit ridership? And then relatedly, generally, what do we think about the future of some of these shared modes, and how much might our adoption of remote work change some of the math and predictions for those spaces?
Yeah, I think the pandemic brings an interesting dimension for the future of these shared mobility technologies. When we first wrote the brief, of course, that was right at the beginning of the pandemic. So these public health issues were beginning to emerge, and it seemed like, issues of social distancing and sanitation become really prominent now when you have something like Uber, where strangers are in close contact. I don't think I can speak too much on if I think they'll rebound. I know that they definitely took a dip a lot of shared mobility took a lot of dips in terms of usage over the pandemic. For example, I know a lot of car sharing companies in the States were leaving cities because there's virtually nobody using these resources, just sitting around. And so there's I feel like there's a bit of a questionable future if it'll ever come back to the prominence it was before the pandemic, where it was really booming. I think as we move forward with this, now there's kind of that element of public health that needs to be integrated with shared mobility technologies. We've seen some stuff like Uber using the face mask selfies that you have to take before you ride and integrating that into the app, and checklists that you have to fill out before you can ride with Uber. So there are some interesting overlaps now with public health, I think, moving forward. And I think that as cities start to think about how we can bring shared mobility back into prominence or bring them into the fold with public transportation, that they'll really have to start thinking about what ways can you build trust in terms of, I'm sure the biggest priority is people are going to choose options where there's a lowered risk of contracting COVID. So they're going to have to think about ways that can be built up again. And I think potentially technological solutions could be one way to build that trust.
Yeah, I want to add one point here. There's been a lot of research on the decline in public transit ridership. Something I haven't seen a lot of research on is the increasing cost of these shared mobility services as the supply and demand curves just become very different. So anecdotally, I know that I just took I took a Lyft for the first time in a very, very long time yesterday. And it was extraordinarily expensive, almost orders of magnitude more expensive than what I would expect pre-pandemic. And what's problematic about this is, of course, that cities don't really have any means to exert kind of caps or say, we want to make sure this is affordable to everyone, right? In a way that public transit has a mandate to offer affordable service to as many citizens as possible. And so I think, with COVID, obviously these companies are hurting. It's also an opportunity for us to say, take a step back and say, okay, Uber and the like have made a lot of money in the past. It's become very ubiquitous. In many ways it does offer an improved service, which, as Tracey talked about, is really kind of an excellent experience in many ways for the user. And now that everyone is kind of suffering in terms of figuring out how to offer transit, like the point A to point B service, effectively and equitably, let's take a step back and say, how do we do this well? The way I think that can be done is with mobility as a service. Some regions, some cities, or kind of state level are thinking about mobility as a service. Amsterdam is an example that comes to mind. It's very difficult politically and sort of economically because in many ways it kind of rebalances the control of a market of rides from point A to point B, and puts the public sector in a stronger position to kind of shape that market on a consolidated application for mobility as a service. But I do think it's a good way of achieving some of our shared goals and still allowing for private service providers to kind of operate in a cost-effective way.
Great. Yes, and I think how we can make a real open smart cities version of mobility as a service a reality is a good topic for a whole other future set of discussions, which would be great. But I think we're at the time when maybe Lucas, do you want to pop back in and take over for me?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Andrew. So yeah, unfortunately, it's almost 1, and we might have to wrap it up. But if anybody didn't get a chance to ask a question and you would really like to have that question answered, I would invite you maybe to stick around until a bit after 1. We have some panelists who might stick around and perhaps address that, right? So anyways, thanks again, Andrew, Tracey, Don, Matthew, for such a rich and interesting conversation. I'm sure we could just keep going on and on for hours, but what do you want? It's we gotta move on, right? But you as a participant, thank you so much for being here today. And whether you're a student, researcher, practitioner, we really hope that you're able to get something out of this conversation. All right. And in fact, we really want to know how much you appreciated it. So Dom will launch a little poll. Okay. And really appreciate if you could take just a few seconds to answer the question that will pop up in the screen, right? That would really help us, us improve the events. Okay. Wait a second. Oh, there you go. I think you should see the poll now. All right, I'll just give you a bit of time to enter that. Right. So if you haven't seen it, it's the screen that just popped up in the middle of the screen. It should be there somewhere. If you just take a bit of time. All right, maybe just a few more seconds.
I feel we should be playing D.
Right. Yeah. But I think that's good. I think that's good. We end the poll now. All right. Perfect. So anyways, thanks again for participating in this event today. And if you're part of the community and would like to take part in the CSN, the Community Solution Network program, I would invite you to reach out to us. We have shared some links in the chat box. Just follow that and we have instructions on how we can join us. All right. And yeah, really hope you will get to see you again in the last event of our summer webinar series, right, on July 28th, which we covered the topic of smart home technology and facilitated violence. All right, so I think we can stop the screen recording.